Die afgelope maand het net soveel migrante Europa oor die Mediterrane See ingekom as wat daardie vasteland in die hele 2014 bereik het. Die oorsake sluit erge konflik in Sirië en ander lande en natuurlik verlammende armoede in. Die reaksies word skerper. Groepe wat immigrasie teenstaan wen in al hoe meer Eurolande veld en aanvalle op vlugtelinge neem hand oor hand toe. Ek gesels nou met Sasha Polakow Suransky, meningsblad-redakteur van die New York Times, wat aan 'n boek oor immigrasie en die reaksies op immigrasie werk. Sasha, welcome to Insig.
Thanks very much.
What does the current backlash look like, and where is it most fierce?
Well, it's happening in different ways in different countries. There's some European countries like Denmark and Holland where there are already right-wing parties that have been in parliaments for quite a long time, and they're gaining more and more popularity. In Denmark, in the last election, the Danish People's Party exceeded 20% for the first time. In Holland, if there were an election held tomorrow, Geert Wilders' party would be the largest in the country. And then in other countries like Germany, you don't really have a backlash that's taken a political form yet, but you have a lot of angry citizens who are not particularly happy with Merkel's policy. And what you've seen in places like Germany and Sweden, the countries that have been most welcoming to refugees, is a real serious backlash, sometimes in the form of violence, burning down the hostels where asylum seekers who've just arrived are housed, and it's getting quite dangerous and quite heated in a lot of places.
So one of the manifestations of the backlash has been the organization called Pegida in Germany, based in Dresden, which is spread across the country. What kind of message do they have in common with these right-wing parties in other European countries? What are they telling their voters to rebel against?
Well, I think the thing with Pegida is they aren't a political party. I mean, it's a street movement, and they've mobilized a lot of people. Their core idea seems to be fear of Islam, fear of immigration, especially Muslims, what they're going to do to German culture. And so they share some of the same ideology as these other parties, but they haven't found an actual organized political outlet for it. And Germany's unique in that sense, but you do have parties starting to form, and even within the governing coalition, Angela Merkel's sort of sister party in Bavaria is much more critical on the refugee issue and much more conservative than she is. And she's had to negotiate that in order to keep her own governing coalition together and her own alliances together in the last week or two.
So the arrival since January, Sasha, in Europe of, I think, 768,000, give or take, a couple of thousand refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants in Europe in 1 year so far, has made the soil quite fertile for the kind of messages which these parties are articulating.
Absolutely.
And why is that? I mean, there seems to be some residual sympathy with the backlash.
Well, it was sort of a pre-existing condition in the sense that these parties existed ever since 9/11. There has been a fear of Islam in Europe and in the United States, and I think that this is just such a dramatic event, what's happened in the last few months. So you had these parties already making these arguments. You had incidents in various different countries, the French attacks on Charlie Hebdo earlier this year, the killing of a Danish Jew outside of a synagogue in Copenhagen. Going back a few years, you had the cartoon controversy, the Muhammad cartoons in the Danish newspapers, which led to attacks on Danish embassies all over the world. In Holland, you had the assassination of Theo van Gogh. And so it's been there. And now you have a dramatic event that's sort of mobilized people, and they've said we were already angry about this, and now we have 700,000 more people coming in, and it's really, for those who are angry about immigration already, it's been a lightning rod.
Do the governments have the power, though, at the moment, to stem the tide and to turn the volume of the flow of people around, after Germany and Austria made such emphatic welcoming messages to Syria, at least a few months ago?
It's difficult for them to do it because people are moving, and unless they completely re-implement border controls within the Schengen zone in Europe, which a lot of people in the EU think would be the end of the European Union. I mean, if you talk to Europeans in various different countries, they're most proud of the open borders between European countries, and what that would require to close individual borders between these countries, I mean, it would mean doing away with a lot of it. I was on a plane a few weeks ago from Vienna to Frankfurt, and there was a German police officer at the door of the plane when you came down the steps to get on the bus, checking every single passport. And you could see on the faces of the Germans and Austrians, who are most of the people on this plane, that they had never seen this before. I mean, this was something, they remember from 20, 30 years ago, and the EU was supposed to do away with that. So it's very difficult for governments to turn this around. I think they're starting to realize that the flow is just too big to manage, but it's unclear what they're going to do, and the EU certainly doesn't seem to have a solution.
Well, the Danish government, now slightly more right-leaning, took out advertisements in Lebanese newspapers recently, telling people, please don't come, your allowance will be less than you think it will be. Is that likely to have any effect? Surely not.
No, I don't think so. And I mean, the only effect it really had was to be mocked in the Danish newspapers because they were bad-mouthing their own country and saying all these horrible things about Denmark. And it was actually modeled on something the Australians did. Australia put up posters in various airports in Indonesia and Pakistan showing a boat in rough seas saying, don't come here, you'll be turned away. And so the Danes were sort of modeling themselves on Australia. And what you hear in a lot of European countries these days is talk about Australia as a solution. And as you know, Australia has one of the most draconian immigration policies in the world, where they turn back boats at sea, and for people who are acknowledged as potential refugees, they're sent away to these asylum seeker camps on remote islands in the Pacific. And now you have Europeans talking about that as a viable solution.
Sasha, those Europeans who are saying that this is unprecedented, the number of people arriving in Europe at the moment, is that historically true? I mean, is immigration into Europe at the moment at a historic high?
It's a dramatic number. There have been other major movements and displacements in European history. Obviously, after World War II, the movement that was going on was on an even larger scale. But I think that if this continues, it will be comparable. So it's not something to be scoffed at, and it's not an easy thing to handle. But I think that all of these countries are going to have to deal with it in a much more forthright way than they have been. If you look, for example, at the last EU agreement, they decided that they were going to reallocate and distribute 160,000 people. That's about 1/5 of the number you mentioned earlier. I mean, it's just not enough, even if they manage to agree, which they don't, because the Poles don't want to take in so many people. The Germans would love it if Slovakia and Poland and the Czech Republic would take a certain number of people, but they're not agreeing to this. And some of these Eastern European countries are saying, we'll only take Syrian Christians. We don't want any Muslims, which of course is a violation of all sorts of refugee conventions, but they're saying it anyway.
Are there lessons or warnings which the South African government should take heed of in the midst of this crisis in Europe?
It's hard to say. I think the situation here is different, but obviously this is a country that also is dealing with a large number of immigrants and a large number of refugees coming from all over the continent. And I think that xenophobia is a problem in South Africa, and it's worth watching Europe and taking what's happening in some of these countries as a warning, because there is violence in Europe now also, and as it becomes a more politically heated issue. And I think as some governments implement policies without taking into account the objections of some sections of the population, there's a risk that these extremist groups will grow more and more powerful.
We all know countries which over many centuries have taken in many immigrants. But are there any examples of countries which have peacefully managed rapid immigration?
Yeah, I think you can look at certain examples. Canada, at various times in its history, has taken in significant numbers of people. I think that if you look at some of the post-World War I population transfers, if you look at the aftermath of World War II, I mean, there were large movements. There were large movements into this country throughout history too. It is possible, but I think it has to be managed very carefully, and politicians have to be careful that they don't overdo it, because even with the most progressive and well-intentioned policies, if the numbers are too high, it becomes difficult for any society to absorb that kind of number and manage it.
Sasha, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Dit was Sasha Polakow Suransky, meningsblad-redakteur van die New York Times. So kom ons ook by die einde van vanaand se regstreekse uitsending van Insig. Sien julle weer volgende week. Totsiens.